everybody. Welcome. Thank you. And actually, just after that comment about Jim Mars, he actually wrote a review on my latest book, How to Talk to an Alien. So it's just too bad that he's not still here. Anyway, welcome. I apologize. I'm going to have to read to you for reasons I think that might become obvious later on. So I'm not going to look at you too much, so I apologize for that. At any rate, when I first told my optometrist about the topic of this presentation, he said, oh, so that's kind of like the when Bugs Bunny looks through that telescope up at Mars, and he looks through it and there's a Martian looking back at him. And I said, yeah, it's kind of like that. But except I'm not talking cartoons, I'm talking reality. So the point of my presentation today is that I'm going to review the history of the remote viewing program with regard to ET targets. And by the way, I'm very politically incorrect, and I apologize in advance. I'll say aliens, ETs, extraterrestrials, you all know what I'm talking about, visitors, whatever. At any rate, we're going to take a look at the remote viewing program with regard to ET targets, but also take a closer look at how we can evaluate the kind of information we get on these targets. And to be clear, I'm interested in how we can get corroborative evidence of ETs using remote viewing targets. I'll talk about old and new ways that we can judge the validity of information we get about extraterrestrials. This has always been a point of contention even among remote viewers. Speaking as someone who is trained in several methods of remote viewing, including controlled remote viewing, which is CRV, associative remote viewing, which is ARV, extended remote viewing, which is ERV, as well as traditional psychic and mediumship methods, I have a great appreciation for protocols and structures of remote viewing that enable us to retroactively judge the accuracy of anyone's statement that they are psychically encountering ETs. A bit later, I'll explain a method of remote viewing that I've developed over many years. It's called TSP, and I believe that brings a new mechanism to the table for remote viewing ETs. And I'm just going to tell you now, I am offering a course for the first time ever, starting March 7, and I'll tell you a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation. All right. Last month, I became a low-level cyborg. I had 2 eye surgeries. They implanted lenses in both of my eyes, which made this whole thing a little scary. All my life, I was at the level of being legally blind and horribly nearsighted. I could only see about 10 inches off of my face. So a person who had 20/20 vision could see at a distance of 2 football fields away what I could see roughly at 20 feet away. And that meant that the person with 20/20 vision would know things about our environment that I couldn't verify until I got close enough to see it for myself. And I would suggest to you that our consensus reality is a little bit like this. We all have different sensory capacities, some better, some worse. And so some of us will literally see things before others of us do. The fact that those of us with poor vision can't know these realities that lie beyond our vision doesn't mean they don't exist. If you can see a little red house with a black roof and 12 pine trees surrounding it, and all I see is a little blob of red and green, doesn't mean those things don't exist. It just means you need to wait for me to get physically close enough to the target so I can see it too, so I can verify your reality. In effect, you have the ability to see into my future, and that's the definition of clairvoyance. Remote viewing is, I would propose to you, like having better than 20/20 vision. It is a strictly sensory experience, and that means if you have perfect 20/20 vision with your physical eyes, but you haven't developed your third eye, or your mind's eye, which is what you use in remote viewing, then you're no better off than I was. You are hideously nearsighted. You won't be able to experience what a remote viewer sees in the distance or the future until your physical body arrives close enough in terms of space or time. Remote viewing was developed at the Stanford Research Institute, which is now known as SRI International, in 1972 with CIA funding, and then expanded in '78 to include the unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, with DIA and Army funding. Collectively, the program was known in all of its incarnations as the Stargate Project. Remote viewing is also known as psychic spying. SRI was the research arm, and Fort Meade was the military intelligence arm of the program. It was a program designed to see things that were literally impossible to see with our physical eyes due to lack of proximity to our physical body, either in terms of space, which is distance, or time. Traditional remote viewing, now known as controlled remote viewing, CRV, which was developed by my mentor, Ingo Swann, along with laser physicists Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, operates much like psychic clairvoyance, but within strict parameters and rules known as protocols. The only information a viewer is given before being asked to describe a target is usually just some random numeric coordinates representing the target. The viewer must describe the target using their psychic skills. The protocols often require that both the viewer and their monitor, if there is one, be double-blind to the target. That's intended to prevent the viewer from reading the monitor's mind, and getting access to information that way. So blindness here means that your mind is blind. You have no knowledge of the target, and therefore your third eye cannot cheat. Remote viewing frequently, but not always, it obtained spectacular actionable intelligence. Some of the more famous instances of remote viewing involved pinpointing downed aircraft in Africa, locating a general who was abducted in Italy, identifying Russian military installations, and other top-secret submarines, and they were all later verified. The only way to know what a viewer saw was whether it was correct or not, was to wait around until actual boots-on-the-ground type of feedback was available. In other words, there was a delay between the sensory experience and confirmation by others. Just like people with 20/20 vision telling nearsighted people, like me, what they could only see if they just had better eyes. The nearsighted folks don't really trust what those with 20/20 vision can see until they get confirmation or their own feedback. And that's how consensus reality works. Remote viewing extraterrestrials in the government military remote programs has traditionally fallen under the category of anomalous targets. This is basically a catch-all for anything weird, mythical, legendary, religious, or off-planet. Anomalous targets are generally frowned upon because of the speculative nature of the subject matter and also the unavailability of feedback to either confirm or deny the information contained in such a session. This did not stop the government from tasking these kinds of bizarre targets, such as other planets, UFOs, and ETs, but it really meant they were used primarily for either training purposes, most notably by retired U.S. Army Major Ed Dames at Fort Meade, or as experimental explorations, and no one has ever admitted to using them for purposes of actionable intelligence. According to Stargate viewer and unit historian Paul Smith, who was in the program from '83 to '90, despite the CIA's massive release of more than 90,000 previously classified documents on the entire Stargate project, which spanned the years of '72 to '95, he's only been able to find 40 or so sessions dealing with anomalous targets. When I asked Uri Geller, the famous Israeli mentalist and spoonbender, who was one of the early remote viewers in the SRI program, whether he had ever viewed ETs, he said such information was still classified, although he felt another release of CIA documents may soon be forthcoming. It is even questionable whether anomalous targets were ever officially tasked under the Stargate project. I spoke with Dale Graff, the former director of the Army's Stargate project, who served as the Department of Defense contract manager for remote research at SRI, starting in '76, and then became director of the Stargate project until '93. I asked him if Stargate officially tasked its viewers with UFO or ET targets. He told me, quote, "Officially, we didn't do it. Our position in government was that remote viewing was already controversial enough, so there was no way anyone wanted to go beyond this," end quote. He did, however, acknowledge that in the viewer's off time, maybe on or off the premises, there were probably a number of taskings that did occur. Dale explained, quote, "The data in Stargate was intended to be literal, so it could be understood as actionable intelligence. You needed it in a form consistent with what you're trying to do. Our intention was to have literal perceptions so it could be useful." By contrast, Stargate monitor and remote viewing trainer, retired U.S. Army Major Ed Dames, pushed the envelope of anomalous targets. His fascination with UFOs and the use of anomalous targets for training the viewers was well known. Dames was probably ahead of his time in exploring these topics, but his technique irritated more than a few viewers in the unit who worked very hard at establishing data that could be objectively verified and analyzed. Unfortunately, Ed's methods violated the basic protocols of CRV. According to several viewers I spoke with, Ed's idea of feedback on a target was to look at the target the night before, do his own session, and come to his own conclusions. He would then compare the viewer's conclusions the next day with his own. And if he matched, if the impressions matched, he considered it to be a hit. Because his methods violated CRV protocols, viewers became increasingly concerned that the results obtained were unreliable. I should point out here, the viewers weren't necessarily disturbed by the idea of remote viewing aliens, not at all. They were disturbed by the idea of not getting legitimate feedback about the reality of aliens. There's a difference. As Ingo Swann used to say, if you can't get feedback, then your remote viewing isn't remote viewing. Without feedback, your data is doomed to live in the limbo land of your subjective imagination. You can forget about contributing anything to consensus reality. The earliest official anomalous targets at SRI and Fort Meade were not UFOs, they were not ETs, they were off-planet locations. It really started with a curiosity about testing the outer limits of a remote viewer's ability to view or sense locations or events that were distant. These early experiments were merely to see if it was possible to go off-planet to remote view things beyond our normal range of knowledge. It was a form of psi testing, that's PSI, testing, more than trying to prove the existence of aliens. Don't forget, in the 60s and 70s, those were heady times for America. We just launched our first satellite in '58. Alan Shepard became the first American to fly in space in '61, followed by John Glenn, who became the first American to orbit the Earth in '62. During the 1960s, unmanned spacecraft had already photographed and probed the moon. By the time Neil Armstrong took that famous giant step for mankind, when he landed on the moon in '69, we already had some idea of what awaited us, at least in terms of topography. I qualify this statement because according to William Mills Tompkins, a former naval intelligence officer who worked on advanced technology projects and who was also an aerospace engineer who worked with a high-level black ops think tank for Douglas Aircraft Company in conjunction with NASA, we had a not-so-friendly alien welcoming committee when we arrived on the moon. According to Tompkins, in his book Selected by Extraterrestrials, the Sea of Tranquility crater where we landed was surrounded by several enormous UFOs, and it was made clear that we were not welcome. Tompkins maintains that Armstrong's 360-degree video scan of the crater area was quickly censored, so the public never saw it, and was classified as above top secret. And you could see I put up on the screen here the sketch that he made, which is his memory of what he saw on the video monitors, apparently, before it was pulled. The reason why it's particularly interesting, at least to me, is because he was originally selected to go into the Navy based upon when he was a kid, he was a teenager, he made these extraordinary models of naval ships and frigates, and he did it because he had a photographic memory. But regardless of whether you choose to believe Tompkins' account or not, we'd managed to complete 6 Apollo missions to explore the moon between 69 and 72. After that, we never went back to the moon. Although as of last July, the Trump administration announced its renewed push for us to go back. And apparently, NASA's Space Launch System is expected to at least put a crew in orbit around the moon by 2022, which is interesting in light of the fact that China and Russia are currently on track to participate in a joint space exploration program starting this year for the next 4 years. And China, which has had several lunar landings, is currently scheduled to bring back the first lunar rock samples for the first time in 30 years. And it's also planning to establish a manned moon base in the not too distant future. So let's see if they get any pushback once they get there. Anyway, for reasons that have baffled an awful lot of people, we abruptly switched the course of our manned space program, started focusing on things like Skylab, space shuttles, and satellites. Nevertheless, during the 1970s, our unmanned spacecraft continued to send us back valuable information about a number of planets. The Mariner spacecraft orbited and mapped the surface of Mars. The Voyager sent back detailed images of Jupiter and Saturn, their rings, and their moons. So it was against this backdrop of space exploration that in 1973, SRI decided to tailor several off-planet remote viewing sessions. Ingo Swann participated in the famous and well-documented viewing of the planet Jupiter that year, and it was summarized in a 300-page report. According to remote viewer and researcher Deborah Katz, the session was front-loaded as follows. When I say front-loaded, just so you understand what I mean, that's a term in remote viewing. That's the information that the viewer is given before they start their session. Normally, you're just given a set of numbers. Originally, they were geographic coordinates, and then they became any set of numbers that represent the target. The target could be anything. If you're front-loaded with a little bit of information, it means you have some limited knowledge of the target itself. At any rate, his front load was, quote, describe the planet Jupiter and unknown information that will be known in the future. Actual feedback about Jupiter began coming in within 4 months, and it continued to come in for the next 7 years. And without going into any great detail, suffice it to say, Ingo had some really amazing hits, and he was highly accurate regarding aspects of Jupiter's atmosphere and the fact that it actually has a ring around it like Saturn, which nobody knew or believed at the time. Other viewers also recall being given off-planet targets. For instance, around 1986, Paul Smith was tasked by Ed Dames to view a target which turned out to be Titan, which is one of Saturn's moons. He wrote about this in his book, Reading the Enemy's Mind. During the course of his viewing, Paul wrote down several impressions, all of which he assumed were nothing more than what we call in remote viewing analytic overlay, or it's short AOL. And what you do is you take your analytic overlays, which is sort of it's an impression that should probably be disregarded as nothing more than a product of the logical mind trying to make sense of these weird images that you're getting. But when you think your mind is trying to make sense of it, you put it over into the right-hand column, you write AOL for analytic overlay, and you write it down and you release it out of your brain. Anyway, he had a bunch of these. So he began to feel his way around the target, and he felt he was certainly not on Earth. It felt cold and barren. He saw a circular object in the sky and assumed it was a large harvest moon. He decided to list a number of his impressions as AOLs because they just seemed wrong. These included astronauts with suits, a space vehicle falling away, irregularly shaped, and a moon. It turned out many of his impressions were actually correct, including the color of Titan, which they learned years later is actually this yellow-orange, which is the color of a harvest moon, which only makes you wonder, how do you cherry pick between your AOLs, your analytic overlay concepts? What about those astronauts in suits? Or what about that space vehicle? Were they also real? And we don't know because there was no feedback, there was no follow-up on those. Eventually, in the Stargate program, off-planet targets began to give way to more unusual targets like UFOs. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of these also. There was only ever one official or formal tasking that involved a UFO, but it was very oblique. This was not a direct question about a UFO. This occurred in 1981 when remote viewer Joe McMoneagle, retired U.S. Army NCO, who served in the unit from 78 to 95, was tasked with what appeared, at least on first glance, to be a normal type of target. The target was a photo, and obviously he didn't see this, but I'm telling you what the target was. The target was a photo taken by a photo reconnaissance satellite. And the question was basically, what do you see in the photo? Of course, what they really wanted to know about was this really unusual little object way in the back of in the background of this photo that resembled a UFO and was clocked going about 7,000 miles an hour. The client for this session was the Army's Intelligence Threat Analysis Center. Joe successfully identified not only the UFO in the background, but also the items and things that were in the foreground. On July 14, 1986, retired U.S. Army Sergeant Lynn Buchanan, who served in the Stargate program from 84 to 92, was tasked in a CIA session to view the famous Rendlesham Forest incident in England. 6 years earlier, I'm sure most of you know this is, Britain's Roswell. Anyway, 6 years earlier, weird lights had been reported in the forest located next to 2 U.S. military air bases. A military search party was sent out. They found a craft, I think it was a triangular craft located in the forest. Lynn was tasked to remote view the interior of this craft. He described a control panel and reported it was an unmanned ship that was scouting a suitable location for the ETs where they should land. Lynn told me he had no idea that 2 nights later, another craft did actually land right nearby, and that would suggest that his remote viewing was in fact accurate. In the mid-1980s, the Fort Meade viewers were tasked to describe a target event that occurred in 1981 in the Gulf of San Matias, located off the east coast of Argentina. The area was considered to be a hotbed of UFO activity and also a possible UFO base. The 4 viewers who did this target, 2 of them in 83 and then 2 in 85, were Joe McMoneagle, Tom McNair, Paul Smith, and Bill Ray. Their work described amazing similarities, all suggestive of the same event. And don't forget, they're working off of just a number. They all described, in similar terms, a situation where a large UFO had hovered over a naval frigate. It cast some type of a very large, weird cloud or a mist over the ship. It panicked the entire crew, and it resulted in total loss of life. They all got this. So the chance that this might have been the result of what we call telepathic overlay was unlikely, since the viewers were separated in their viewings by years, as well as, they were doing this individually. By contrast with Stargate targets involving planets and UFOs, extraterrestrials were rarely used as actual targets. Other than a few practice ET targets given by Ed Dames, including the Galactic Federation headquarters and an unspecified CE3 encounter, the viewers were never told to view ETs directly. This didn't mean that many of the viewers did not encounter ETs in their sessions. And I actually find it somewhat extraordinary that many of the viewers accidentally bumped into ETs while they were doing other targets. There are even some examples of when the viewers went to the same target and saw the same ETs. So, for me, this begins to sound like corroborative evidence. The most famous example can be found in Ingo Swann's thinly disguised autobiography, Penetration, The Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy, which got published in '95, in which he was allegedly tasked with viewing a moon base on the far side of the moon. As he was describing a base with strange vehicles, exotic machinery, and tall buildings, to his surprise, he came across a number of humanoid ETs who suddenly became aware of his presence. He felt immediately vulnerable, like a spy who'd been caught spying, which is what he was doing, and quickly ended his session. He later claimed that much of his structural information about the moon base was verified by later NASA photos. Another famous example occurred in '84 when Joe McMoneagle was tasked with viewing Mars in the year 1 million BC. He began describing some pretty weird conditions. He wrote he saw, quote, severe clouds, more like a dust storm, that were the, quote, after effect of a major geological problem, end quote. He also described seeing mountains of dirt that appeared and disappeared, along with large flat surfaces and megalithic, that's his word, structures. When he was asked by his monitor to move backwards in time, and by the way, his monitor happened to be his future father-in-law, it was Bob Monroe at the Monroe Institute. So his monitor asked him to move backwards in time to the time of this geological upheaval. And all of a sudden, Joe began to describe humanoids who were, quote, very tall and thin. He said, quote, it's only a shadow. It's as if they were there and they're not there anymore, end quote. His monitor instructed Joe to go back to the time when the people were present. That's when things got very strange. He said, quote, I just keep seeing very large people. They appear tall, thin and tall, but they're large, wearing some kind of strange clothes. He then began to describe structures like aqueducts, roads shaped like curved channels, giant pyramids that were huge, and, quote, like shelters from storms, end quote. Joe entered a pyramid and made the following comments, quote, different chambers, but they're almost stripped of any kind of furnishings or anything. It's like a strictly functional place of sleeping, or that's not a good word, hibernation, end quote. His monitor asked him to talk about these people who were sleeping through the storms. Joe said, quote, very tall again, very large people, but they're thin. They look thin because of their height and dress in, oh hell, it's like a real light silk, but it's not a flowing type of clothing. It's like cut to fit, end quote. Later he added, quote, they're ancient people, they're dying. It's past their time or age. They're very philosophic about it. They're looking for a way to survive, and they just can't. They're hanging on while they look or wait for something to return or something coming with the answer, end quote. When his monitor asked him what these tall people were waiting for, Joe said a group or party of them had left to find a new place to live, end quote. There was lots more striking information in this session, but basically Joe had zeroed in on some intelligent entities, what we would call ETs, who lived in a violent atmospheric environment on Mars after some type of geological destruction. They created pyramids and other structures and basically died out after exploratory space missions never returned for them. That was back in 1984. Most of us have now seen the NASA photos of the famous face of Mars, as well as the pyramids. I've got one up on the screen of the famous D&M pyramid structure. And 3 years after Joe's session, Richard Hoagland published his book, The Monuments of Mars, A City on the Edge of Forever, outlining his theory, suggesting, among other things, the face of Mars and its related pyramid structures suggested Mars had, in fact, once been home to a lost civilization. Now, in 1995, this is 11 years after Joe's session, Ingo decided to task 5 viewers. And this included retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Tom McNair, who served in the program, Stargate program, from 81 to 85. And they were tasked with the same target, planet Mars. Tom shared a story with me that he said he's actually only ever told 1 or 2 people in his life. It's a highly personal story, and he gave me permission to repeat it here. The story is about what he saw when he viewed the Mars target. The sessions were conducted independently by all the viewers, and Tom mailed in his session results to Ingo. What he did before he actually opened up the envelope that contained the target coordinates, he sort of began tuning into what the target was going to be. So he begins to describe smells, the surface, the heat, and the textures of what he firmly believed was the Martian environment for about 5 minutes. And just as an aside, he was really pleased when 25 years later, he got confirmation. He was told at the time he did that there was no way you could know what the smell on Mars was. But because since then we've been able to do various, chemical analyses, we now know what the smell is. And it confirmed what he had remote viewed way back then. At any rate, Tom also began describing other intelligent beings at this site. When he later reviewed the tape of his session, he was struck by the fact that his time with these off-planet beings only lasted about 3 or 4 minutes, but to him, it felt like it had lasted about either an hour and a half. So there was this different time sensation operating. He was so struck by his experience with these ETs, he recorded it in what we call in CRV protocols as an aesthetic impact. That's AI for short, not the same thing as an AOL. AOL is analytic overlay. AI is aesthetic impact, and basically that refers to this incredibly profound moment when you're starting to really tap into the target accurately, and you begin to feel like you've actually kind of been transported there to the actual target location. So, what were these extraterrestrials like? Tom is very protective of his characterizations of them for fear of diminishing the true impact of their reality and his intense emotional reaction to this session. He wrote in his session that he felt a pervasive sense of sadness among these beings, a great sense of loss, like they were, in his words, quote, left behind with a commitment that someone would return for them. They waited for those entities to return, end quote. He said they'd been there for a very long time and were beginning to lose hope. He interacted with 2 of them. One was seated, one was standing to his right. He didn't actually see them in the strictest sense of the word, but he felt that he was communicating with them telepathically. So imagine his surprise when 9 years after his session, he finally gets around to reading Joe McMonagle's book on seeing ETs on Mars called Mind Track. Tom said he literally jumped out of his seat when he read these passages. Tom told me, quote, it was like he and I were there at the same time, end quote. When he read Joe's description of the skin-tight clothing on those extremely tall, thin humanoids, Tom said his reaction was to say to himself, well, exactly right. Furthermore, Tom had also seen visions of a large room with sloping walls and a cavernous feeling, very, very similar to Joe's description of those big, empty rooms inside this huge pyramid that he'd entered. More importantly, it seems, in both sessions, the ETs exhibited a strong sense of sadness and hopelessness because they'd been left behind and were waiting for the others to return and rescue them. Joe said in his transcript, quote, "It's like a perception of a shadow of people, very tall and thin. It's only a shadow. It's as if they were there and they're not there anymore." Tom used almost identical language when explaining to me that he'd written in his what he'd written in his transcript. He said, quote, "They were very tall, thin, and frail-looking, but they weren't frail. That was an illusion that was created by their height." He said, "They were almost like shadows of people more than people. Maybe I communicated with their memories," end quote. ETs were not only inadvertently discovered on other planets by the viewers, but also, perhaps more interestingly, right here on Earth. As part of his legacy, SRI's star remote viewer, Pat Price, he was a former California police officer, he had left some notes of his unofficial viewing while at SRI of 4 suspected ET Earth bases. After Pat Price's mysterious death in 1975, Hal Puthoff eventually handed off these notes in the early 80s to Lieutenant F. Holmes, better known as Skip Atwater, the founder of the Stargate program at Fort Meade. Pat Price's psychic abilities were so good that his sessions were apparently considered to be, it was like the gold standard. They were as good as getting actual feedback. He had some amazing accuracy hit rate. I think it was, if I'm remembering, it was really close to 99%, which is an amazing tribute to his psychic intelligence. At any rate, Pat had identified 4 UFO bases located in or near mountains. The 4 bases were located at Mount Perdido, the highest mountain in the Pyrenees on the mountain range side in Spain, Mount Inyangani, hope I'm pronouncing that right, the highest mountain in Zimbabwe, Africa, Mount Hayes in Alaska, and Mount Zeal in Australia. Pat indicated his belief that there were actually many more UFO bases on Earth, but these were the ones he chose to use as targets. Apparently, each base served a different purpose, including complex transport, communications, and monitoring functions. Interestingly, Pat's session notes give us some insight into his observations about the ETs running these bases. According to an article entitled "Remote Viewing Underground UFO Bases," published in Rense.com in 2005, Pat reported that the primary purpose of the base was, quote, "to reinforce BTL implants," and apparently nobody had any idea what that meant, "the transport of new recruits and overall monitoring function." Furthermore, regarding the ET occupants, Price reported, quote, that the base inhabitants looked like us, Homo sapiens, except for the heart, lungs, blood, and eyes, end quote. He reported the sites were highly protected from discovery, they were mutually supportive, and had very high technology. He also noted the ETs at these bases used what he called, quote, "thought transfer for motor control of us," end quote. Now, Lynn Buchanan told me that all the viewers at Fort Meade were eventually given Pat's UFO bases as practice targets over the years. Lynn also said that none of the viewings by him or his other colleagues ever resulted in actionable intelligence. So Joe McMoneagle was tasked with the Alaska base in '82, followed by Paul Smith in '85, Mel Riley in '86. And Lynn was tasked with the Australian base around 1989. Without going into detail over each viewing of the Alaska base site, suffice it to say that not only did Mel seem to sense the presence of non-human figures at a strange control panel, But Paul and Joe described technologies that were well beyond anything they had ever seen before. Now, an interesting aside is that the top-secret high-frequency active auroral research program, better known as HAARP, with its array of radio telescopes, is actually located only about 100 miles from the Alaska target site of Mount Hayes. Lynn, on the other hand, was tasked with the UFO base in Australia. He said during his sessions he felt strongly this base was a port of entry for alien entities. According to Lynn, it was also an underground repair base. He said this was the only base where Pat had actually gotten scared, and he left the site while viewing. He said, quote, Pat Price was viewing it, and they, meaning the aliens at the base, caught him viewing. Pat said they weren't hostile, but it scared him so bad, he quit the whole session, end quote. Of course, this reminds me immediately of Ingo's reaction when he got caught spying on the aliens on the dark side of the moon. It caused him to jump out of his session. Lynn told me, quote, I also got caught, which is very unusual for CRV because you can't get caught if you're doing it right. They let me know, they, meaning the aliens at the base, let me know it was okay for me to look around and be there, walk around and look at the floor plans, end quote. Now, according to Lynn, the Australian base consisted almost exclusively of aliens, although he said there did seem to be some humans working there, dressed in light gray suits. They were doing menial chores. He described them as sort of gophers or mechanics, but not slaves, by the way. He described a large open space like a waiting room or transport station. He saw a giant cradle-shaped structure that was used to anchor the incoming egg-shaped UFOs. Interestingly, Pat had also described a huge cradle-like structure at this location. According to Lynn, the passengers would disembark on the upper level while the crew disembarked one floor below. Lynn remembers one of the passengers as being, quote, gray with a small child who was gray, end quote. When I pressed him on the other people who were getting on and off the craft, he said, quote, I think there were all types, humans, grays, and some tall skinny beings, like the ones Ingo saw on the moon, end quote. The only feedback he ever received were Pat's sessions and some feedback from an Australian military official confirming lots of UFO activity at the site. I asked Lynn what it felt like to interact with ETs as he remote viewed them. Lynn has always been adamant that you cannot get caught spying psychically if you're using CRV protocols. He says you can get caught if you're just using your skills as a natural psychic. But to me, the obvious question was, why, if Lynn was using CRV protocols while viewing the Australian base, did he get caught spying by the aliens who were there? And Lynn said, quote, certain types of ETs can pick up a presence, even if you're using CRV with the strictest protocols. The ones that have caught me as I was viewing them were the tall ones, what you might call the Nordics. They are human-looking, about 7 feet tall. With the other ones, the grays, you can do anything at all, and they'll never pick up your presence, end quote. So since the days of Stargate, many remote viewers have remote viewed extraterrestrials. Angela Thompson Smith, one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association, known as IRVA, wrote a book about how she used ERV, that's extended remote viewing techniques. It's more like a meditational type of a technique, to remote view 18 different predetermined species of aliens. And what she did is kind of interesting. She modified a type of a questionnaire that had been used to survey different indigenous groups around the world and ask them about their culture and their all kinds of things about them. She modified it so that she could ask every single different species of alien the same questions and get at least something kind of across the board that way, which was interesting. And she's written about it. I mean, she was partially front-loaded. She was told which alien species to view. And as far as I know, there is no other corroboration than this sort of internal quasi-corroboration between her results. British remote viewer Daz Smith, who works with Courtney Brown's Farsight Institute, he's also the publisher of the 8 Martini magazine, says he and others have successfully viewed UFOs and ETs using CRV. He has given me several examples, including, quite locally, the Phoenix Lights, Area 51, Mars, the Moon, and Roswell. Daz claims aliens were seen at all of these locations by multiple viewers. He also confirms for me that almost every remote viewer has, at one time or another, run into aliens in their sessions. On September 1st of last year, 2017, Daz did a blind target that turned out to be the Roswell UFO crash site. His descriptors and sketches were actually really dead-on accurate. I put up 2 pages from his actual session, the page 1 on the left and page 5 on the right, just to give you an idea. The first thing he did immediately as he tunes in from, that's called an ideogram, it's sort of a little scribble that you do to start out with. And he writes down, you could see, well, maybe you can't see it, over on the right-hand column, it says AOL, collision, which means he didn't trust, he figured, oh, I must be thinking collision, so I'm gonna get rid of that thought. Turns out it was accurate. But later he started to tune in more and more into those sensations. And he, in the rest of the session, begins to describe an accident that occurred in a remote area of land involving a, quote, metallic/moving/object, end quote. His sketches show the disc-shaped spacecraft crashing into the ground. If you look on the one on the right-hand side, you see he sketched it. Sure looks like a saucer crashing into the ground to me. He also wrote that he felt that there were 2 life forms inside and 2 outside of it. He wrote, quote, I don't feel all the life die, not at least right away. I can feel their pain/remorse/loss, end quote. Anyone familiar with the Roswell incident has heard about the various eyewitness accounts of the, I believe it's generally considered 4 gray aliens that were taken from the crash site, and 1 or 2 of them still potentially living. So I found this last part especially interesting because many in the UFO field assume the small grays are androids or robots, but according to Daz's impressions, they too have emotions. So I feel this is potentially an important piece of data regarding gray aliens. I put up there also, since Daz is a talented artist, and he's been, before doing remote viewing, he was actually very involved in the UFO field and has drawn lots of sketches of ETs, although he never does them for his CRV sessions. And I put up one of his sketches. Okay, so I want to go back briefly, summarize what the Stargate project accomplished in terms of pushing the envelope of our understanding and our appreciation of the alien presence. 1, we know there was at least 1 official tasking and many unofficial taskings of UFOs. 2, there were many unofficial taskings of ETs and ET bases, and there may be more to be declassified in the future. 3, the remote viewers in the program were, on several occasions, able to corroborate observations of ET activity on Earth and other planets, and it's unlikely that there was telepathic overlay. And 4th, the remote viewers reported observing a number of different ET species that included Nordics, humanoids, and grays. According to the viewers with whom I spoke, there are no official ways to judge the accuracy of these anomalous targets. Paul Smith said his method was basically just to evaluate the trustworthiness of the project managers, the monitors, and the viewers. Lynn Buchanan said 2 methods were employed when dealing with anomalous targets where you didn't have feedback. So the first one was the average success of the viewer, and that's based on the cumulative record of accuracy in all of that viewer's targets. And you just say, well, if they were good at, if let's say they had a 76% accuracy rate with everything else cumulatively, well then you could project that the likelihood of anything they said in this anomalous target was 76% likely correct. The other method was the consensus analysis, which was based on the averaged cumulative success of all of the viewers who viewed the same target. So now, speaking to you as an attorney, I believe the Stargate project was, in some sense, able to produce both direct and indirect evidence demonstrating the presence of ETs. Direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. Given that remote viewing doesn't necessarily involve the witness or the viewer, in this case, being physically present at a location, this kind of testimony was further corroborated, if you will, by other viewers who experienced the same data at the same location. In effect, you get several eyewitnesses. Of course, like any type of courtroom testimony, you have to evaluate the credibility of the witnesses and their observations. But that's why remote viewing protocols are so important. You have to try to limit the opportunity also for telepathic overlay. Telepathic overlay would be kind of like letting all of your witnesses go and sit in the same waiting room together before they give their courtroom testimony, and they get to swap stories with each other, and they start to pollute each other's recollections. The other kind of evidence about the ET presence produced by the Stargate project was essentially indirect or circumstantial evidence. And this came in the form of the viewers being able to see information that was essentially unknowable at the time that they saw it. This included observations about geological, archaeological, and atmospheric conditions on other planets as well as Earth. Many of their observations were later confirmed by hard science. So this is indirect evidence of other data that's suggestive of, but not conclusive, of the viewer's other impressions of the ET presence. So, in my opinion, although this might not necessarily satisfy Carl Sagan's scientific requirement that extraordinary claims requires extraordinary proof, let's be real. We've sent people to the electric chair based on lesser standards of evidence than this. Our normal scientific method hasn't been able to capture or analyze the ET phenomenon. Our consensus reality has a bias in favor of scientific evidence, and without it, we can't agree that ETs are part of our reality. However, I do know many high-level quantum physicists who are finally warming up to the idea that we need to scrap the scientific method in favor of a different way to evaluate reality. So I believe we're already moving in that direction. But in the meantime, we need some kind of acceptable standard of evidence by which to judge the reality of this kind of phenomenon that seems to elude scientific capture. It's kind of like trying to find the invisible hacker in the matrix of our reality. So why not go with some of our consensus-friendly legal standards of proof? And I put a bunch of them up here on the screen. You can see that the highest level of proof is, we use it in our criminal cases. It's the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. But what you have in the center is the standard that's used in most civil cases, is the preponderance of the evidence level of proof. I don't think we can really use the reasonable doubt standard because it implicates our belief system about what is reasonable. And we're so dependent upon the scientific method to dictate to us what should or should not be part of our consensus reality. We tend to believe if science can't prove the reality of ETs, well then, they don't exist. And that's why I think we need to use the more objective standard of preponderance of the evidence. This standard basically weighs the quantity of the evidence used to judge the truth, as opposed to knocking out all evidence based upon a preferred quality of evidence, namely scientific evidence. So I think it's really time we start to change our standards so we can expand our consensus reality to include the ET presence. So I'm now going to push the envelope a little bit further. Turns out to be a little bit maybe coincidental that the work that I've done over many years to develop a new type of remote viewing that I call TSP has actually resulted, in my opinion, in a potential new way to corroborate evidence of ETs. The TSP is basically a hybrid of a bunch of techniques that I've gathered over the years from CRV protocols, psychic and mediumship skills, and intuitive Gestalt psychotherapeutic methods. I believe it takes the best of these worlds and combines them into a brand new remote viewing format. In the past, remote viewers have corroborated evidence of anomalous targets with other remote viewers. What I'm proposing to you here is that you can use remote viewing in conjunction with other types of mental processes, like hypnotic regression. You can get concrete feedback from the actual experiencer, so it's not just all speculative. I am further proposing that my TSP method is potentially even more useful than CRV. And I'll explain to you why I think this. TSP allows the viewer to be front-loaded to a degree. And as I explained to you, that's kind of a no-no in CRV. You're supposed to go in totally blind. However, and that wasn't always done, by the way, as you also know. However, in TSP, the front-loading consists of any questions that the client wants to have answered. In CRV, the target is a single location, event, or person. And yes, it's true, with CRV, you can mechanically move your position in space or time, but it's always in relation to that target. The target is a fixed thing, not a fluid thing. TSP, on the other hand, is not limited to a location, and so TSP viewers can gather data at a variety of locations as long as they're relevant to the target question, which is asked by the client. This allows TSP viewers to obtain additional information that might not otherwise be accessible to CRV viewers. So I put together just a couple of schematics to show you, give you a rough idea what I'm talking about in terms of corroboration. So this first slide just shows you can get a number of different remote viewers as eyewitnesses. Each one has their unique perspective from their own space-time vantage point, looking at the target, which explains why you may get different information from different viewers. The next slide, this one, shows how the basic CRV model works, where you can have one or more remote viewers who they're all looking at the same target, and their impressions can be compared and corroborated either with each other, or if you're lucky enough to get an eyewitness to the event, you compare them with the eyewitness. This slide shows how eyewitness corroboration works in the context of hypnotic regression. The eyewitness may suffer from a faulty memory about an event, let's say an abduction event. So in hypnosis, their subconscious goes back to re-experience the same event. The subconscious becomes a kind of second eyewitness. The subconscious matches and compares data with the conscious mind of the experiencer. Only problem with this one is that there's little chance that this is ever going to be considered solid, direct evidence, because a person can't corroborate their own testimony. You need another eyewitness. If you're lucky, you might get a situation where you might have another experiencer who might corroborate your story. That happened, for example, in the famous Betty and Barney Hill case, where they both recalled for the first time under hypnosis in separate sessions common elements of their famous 1961 abduction. So here's the crazy thing. Well, developing TSP, I never considered the possibility it could be used to corroborate actual or hypnotic memories of abductees. However, one day I did a reading that completely changed my beliefs. The client claimed to have had an abduction experience. He had some actual memories and some hypnotically recalled memories of the event. His target questions, which I asked for TSP, were wanting to know more about the abduction. I did what I call my advanced reading, which is basically I take just the questions. I have no other information. I don't talk to the client. I start writing. I get information. that way. I call that's the advanced reading. It's always done in writing, documented, prior to ever talking to the client. So I did that, and I came up with a bunch of impressions. Some of them were relevant to his abduction event, maybe, and some of them weren't. I told the client there were 2 spacecraft involved. They'd come from the direction of New York City, headed west over the Hudson River to the client's location in New Jersey. How did I know this? My point of consciousness was about 1,000 to 2,000 feet up in the air. From this vantage point, I got a clear aerial view of the client's former apartment building. It was a large, flat-topped, rectangular-shaped, white apartment building with white trim. Client confirmed my entire description of his former residence where the abduction had taken place. My next question to him was whether he had had his head propped up high on pillows when the aliens entered his bedroom that night. Client confirmed that was also true. I then described a particular piece of handheld alien technology involving a strange glassy metallic holographic screen. I saw the ETs huddled together holding it and pointing out things to the client on the screen. To my great surprise, at this point, my client started to cry. And very emotionally, he told me this was also accurate and this had occurred while he was on the spacecraft. There was a lot of other accurate information in the reading, but I don't have time to discuss it here. What I didn't realize until much later after doing this reading was that I had, in effect, hacked the consciousness of these ETs. My TSP method allowed me to basically biohack the interior perspective of an alien. Unlike all those examples I gave you earlier of Stargate viewers encountering aliens at the target site, I wasn't merely spying on or observing aliens at the target site. I wasn't observing their behaviors. I wasn't having a telepathic dialogue with them. I was inside of them. I was looking out at the world through their eyes. I wasn't observing their feelings. I was inside their feelings. And believe me, I wasn't trying to do this. It just happened, and I wasn't even aware of it at the time. I believe this happened because my target, which happened to be my client's questions about his abduction, was larger than a specific event or target location. In TSP, you can gather information that may or may not be related to the location, but it will still be a legitimate focus of your intention, and because it relates to the client's question. So this broadens the universe of relevant facts and perspectives from which you can draw. Being inside another entity can give you all kinds of additional data about an event. And by the way, if we're ever going to compete on an evolutionary level with some of these ETs, it's my firm belief that we need to access their brains just as they seem to have unlimited access to ours. Anyway, I realized at some point in retrospect, I had obtained my data not as a speck of consciousness wandering around the target, but as a result of traveling with the ETs prior to and during this abduction event. For example, I realized all my aerial data was because I saw it from inside their spacecraft, and not because my consciousness was floating around in the air. When I saw the client's head propped up high on pillows, I saw it from the location and height as if I were inside the consciousness of the ETs in his bedroom looking at him. It was as if I had a subjective, not purely objective view of this event. After doing this reading, it dawned on me that TSP could be a very useful tool when used in conjunction with hypnotic regression of abductees. So as you can see in my little schematic drawing here, it differs from CRV, because in CRV, everybody's looking at the same target. In TSP, the contactee is both a direct eyewitness and also a secondary hypnotized eyewitness to the same abduction event. The TSP viewer is not limited to viewing the abductee as a target, but is free to view the larger overall context from the point of view of the alien. The TSP target, if you recall, is not a fixed location. It's a question. So I think TSP can offer a secondary pathway to get feedback confirmation of the client's memories of an event. I seem to have biohacked in the mind, maybe, of another alien in a different TSP situation. This client has had many, many unusual UFO close encounters and has got some extraordinary video footage, like stuff I have not seen before, which he showed me after I had done my reading. His questions had to do with whether I'd picked up anything regarding a message to him from ETs, because as far as he was concerned, he'd never had a direct encounter. So towards the end of my advanced reading, I suddenly felt sucked into a kind of involuntary channeling of what seemed like it came from either an alien or a group of aliens. I began to watch my hand write down words faster than I could think them, which is a form of what's known as automatic writing. Personally, I've never been a fan of channeling anything, and I don't care whether it's a deceased spirit or some type of entity. I don't enjoy having my body and mind basically taken over and having to vacate it. I don't think it's a good idea. My goal is always to have some type of separate dialogue and communication, so this was very unusual for me. Right before I wrote down their message to him, I'd written down something else that seemed highly irrelevant and very unlikely. I wrote, quote, "Have you ever had a burn mark on the elbow crease of your left arm?" When I asked my client about this, he was absolutely stunned. He said, quote, "Wow, that's the wow moment of the day. How the hell did you see that?" End quote. His immediate feedback was as follows. One day, when he was a kid getting ready to go to school, he'd walked past his mom who was ironing clothes. Somehow he tripped over the ironing board. The hot iron fell and burned the elbow crease of his left arm, leaving him with a permanent scar. So you might ask, how is that relevant to ETs? Well, it works like this. The accuracy level of the overall feedback on the advanced reading gives a type of I have a scoring system set up for it, which provides a reasonable assumption about the remainder of the unverifiable data, such as, let's say, channeled messages from ETs. Uncanny bits of data operate as one of my predictors in my scoring system. And so overall, it suggests that certain data is not going to be totally speculative or simply a product out of my imagination. Since civilians and abductees aren't likely to get scientifically verifiable feedback about the behavior or nature of ETs in the near future, I think TSP offers a kind of alternative option. It's the equivalent to eyewitness testimony that can be corroborated. I think TSP may have a real future if it's used in conjunction with information obtained by experiencers, particularly those who undergo hypnotic regression. So in conclusion, I hope this presentation has given you a good overall framework from which we can begin to consider how to evaluate the ways in which we can remote view ETs and hopefully learn more about them. We all have psychic abilities. I believe the human race must begin to acknowledge this so that we can expand our consensus reality. Assuming aliens are among us, it is imperative that we learn new ways to corroborate their existence. And I believe this is critical to the evaluation of our species so we can survive within the galactic civilization. So I want to thank you very much. And if any of you are interested either in the TSP course, which, as I said, starts March 7, I'm offering it for the first time. If you're interested in any of my books, come see me. I've got a little table out back. So thank you.
All right, I heard a couple woos.